So you recall, hopefully this looks a little bit familiar. We want to start by reading the blurb, then we want to sandwich the passage, and then we want to do that sort of helicopter view of the questions and try and categorize them, sort of triage which ones we want to use, which ones we want to answer first. And remember, those are the vocab and context, the line questions, the graph questions, and the broad questions. And we want to answer them more or less in that order. And at that point, once we're ready to actually answer the questions, we want to paraphrase those key phrases, focusing on the action words. And, paraphrase just means to put it in our own words, because if you recall, as we already said, the SAT is not going to give you word for word answers. It's going to give you good evidence. The evidence will be there in the passage, but it likely won't be in the same word described in the question. At that point, we look at the evidence with those phrases in mind that we've come up with ourselves. We develop our own answer based on our words and the passage's evidence, and then we look at the choices. Then we select the choice that most closely matches the answer that you have already. Okay. So usually the double headers are in the category of history. Here we have something rather unique. We have a double header passage that is a hard science passage. So we're being given two different pieces of literature, and we're being asked how they interact. This can of course be incredibly intimidating, right? Because we're being given two passages to keep track of at once. Yes, so this is SAT Practice Test 9, and we are on page 439 of the PDF. It's the 17th page, but it's numbered page 439. So if you get to and the PDF to download is in the chat. If you haven't done that already, you're just going to want to click on that and scroll all the way down to practice test 9. If you take away nothing else for the double header passages, is that you treat these like two different tests. Rather than read both and then try to keep straight in your head which questions are about which passages, answer all the passage 1 questions, then answer all the passage 2 questions like it's its own test. And then after that, only then will the SAT be asking you questions about both. Questions about what passage 1 might think about passage 2. So I'm going to explain that in a little more detail as we go, but let's just start with it. Let's just start treating passage 1 like it's its own thing. I'm going to get the questions down on here, so I'm doing less scrolling. All right, so let us look at the blurb for passage 1. Passage 1 is adapted from Brian Handwerk. A new antibiotic found in dirt can kill drug-resistant bacteria. Well, that is a very straightforward title. I think we know exactly what this is going to be about. We're going to find something in the dirt, and it's going to kill bacteria that is resistant to medicine. That's the nice thing about hard science passages, is they don't really play around as much as the literature of narrative fiction does. All right, so let's start sandwiching, like first and last paragraphs, first and last sentences. Pathogens are acquiring resistance faster than we can introduce new antibiotics, and this is causing a human health crisis, says biochemist Kim Lewis of Northeastern University. Okay, I'm going to make sure, highlight her name. And this seems like a fairly important idea. Lewis is part of a team that recently unveiled a promising antibiotic born from a new way to tap the powers of soil microorganisms. All right, let's skip to the last one here. Scientists' best efforts to create mutant bacteria with resistance to the drug failed, meaning tixobactin could function effectively for decades before pathogens naturally evolve resistance to it. Now, if your eyes are glazing over already, reading about tixobactin and pathogens, just take a deep breath. This is not a science test. This is a reading test. For some of you, that may make you more relaxed. For some of you, you may wish this was a science test. In the end, we're really just being asked if we can move through the main ideas of these passages, not if we understand exactly what tixobactin is. Natural microbial substances from soil bacteria and fungi have been at the root of most antibiotic drug development during the past century. Okay, so this is a thing that a science passage will do a lot. They set up the status quo, and then they add a twist. But only about 1% of these organisms can be grown in a lab. I'll just probably keep moving with this paragraph, honestly. Where have the rest been grown? Staggering numbers have remained uncultured and of limited use to medical science until now. Okay, that seems important because there's a sudden shift. I'll skip the rest of that paragraph. To do this, I don't really know what this is, but that's okay. The team designed a gadget that sandwiches a soil sample between two membranes, each perforated with pores that allow molecules like nutrients to diffuse through, but don't allow the passage of cells. All right, so I'll probably highlight this because I'll definitely need to understand what that's about at some point. We just use it to trick the bacteria into thinking they are in their natural environment, Lewis says. All right, we've maintained with this one character throughout the whole thing. The team isolated 10,000 strains of uncultured soil bacteria and prepared extracts from them that could be tested against nasty pathogenic bacteria. Okay? So now we're getting into the actual verbs. We're getting into the science as it's behaving. So these respiratory tract infections, including blah, 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 were treated with tixobactin, and the drug knocked out the infections with no noticeable toxic effects. Okay, that is definitely important. And now we're at the last paragraph. It's likely that tixobactin is effective because of the way it targets disease. So now we have the why and the how. The drug breaks down bacterial cell walls by attacking the lipid molecules and that the cell creates organically. Many other antibiotics target the bacteria's proteins, and the genes that encode these proteins can mutate to produce different structures. Okay, so we have a fairly good idea of the status quo that this science passage sets up and the way that this new research is going to change things. And if we don't have a great idea of what all those things are, I would say that's okay. We're going to figure it out as we move through the questions. So the first paragraph of passage 1 primarily serves 2. Well, that's sort of I would probably call that a line question. It's a little bit broad because we're being asked about what its service is. What its service is in the larger context of the passage. But we are being given a specific thing to look at. How about number 44? The author of passage 1 suggests that an advantage of the methods Lewis' team used to grow microorganisms is that well, okay, this looks broad. However, number 45 is asking which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question. Whenever we see something that looks like it's just talking about a main idea, we want to make sure that we check to see if any are connected to it. So I draw a little arrow there just so I know that these two line questions should not be answered without the help of the other. So we took care of 44 and 45. And now already we're in passage 2 questions, right? So we don't need to worry about it because we're only doing one question at a time. So let's start with our line questions that are a little bit more specific than the full paragraph. The author of passage 1 suggests that an advantage of the method Lewis's team used to grow microorganisms is that it, okay, so I see the keywords advantage. We're looking at the methods. And growing microorganisms. So what are some synonyms of these keywords? Well, another word for an advantage might be a benefit. Methods, that could just be like the tools used. That could be the processes. We might want to look for that kind of synonym. And growing microorganisms. So, microorganisms could include bacteria. It could include really anything, any small living thing, right? Any sort of antibiotic. So whatever the answer to number 44 is, it's going to be in one of the lines offered in number 45. So we need to find something in 45 that has to do with the synonyms for these key phrases. So let's hop to it here. Lines 17 to 21, starting with but only and ending with now. You see how we already sort of marked that transition. But only about 1% of these organisms can be grown in a lab. The rest, in staggering numbers, have remained uncultured and of limited use to medical science until now. Well, that's not talking about anything that Kim's team is doing, Kim Lewis. Anything that Lewis's team is doing. It's really only talking about how things have been done until now. So I don't like A. Lines 28 to 32, starting with to do and ending with cells. To do this, the team designed a gadget that sandwiches a soil sample between two membranes, each perforated with pores that allow molecules like nutrients to diffuse through, but don't allow the passage of cells. And if we look at the context here, we just use it to trick the bacteria into thinking they're in their natural environment. So that definitely has to do with the growth, but not necessarily why it's an advantage, why it's a benefit. So I'm going to mark B, but it might not be our best answer. Let's look at C, lines 32 to 34. Yeah, we just use it to trick the bacteria into thinking they're in their natural environment. So we already read that. And it doesn't really give us any more information than B. So that's kind of a dead heat, but the fact that they're both giving the same amount of information makes me think that, they may end up canceling each other out. Lines 44 to 47, starting with it's likely and ending with organically. It's likely that the teixobactin is effective. Okay, so we have an increase in efficacy, a benefit perhaps, because of the way it targets disease. The drug breaks down bacterial walls by attacking the lipid molecules that the cell creates organically. Well, that has to do with the efficacy of how the teixobactin works, not necessarily with the methods that Lewis is using. So I think right now we're still sort of in that tie between B and C. So if we look back at B and C, this is a lot of how, right? The passage of cells. But it doesn't necessarily get at the advantage. So I think I like C better than B. We use it to trick the bacteria into thinking they're in their natural environment. That seems like an advantage of those methods. But let's see if anything matches that idea. Basically, the fact that they are making the bacteria think that they're growing in an environment that they're not in, making the bacteria think that they're in, not an artificial passage, or not an artificial environment, but a more organic environment. So an advantage of Lewis's methods is that it identifies the requirements for soil bacteria to thrive and replicates those features in artificial soil. Let's look at this. I told you we would probably have to figure out what that this refers to. I'm sorry I'm hopping around a little bit here. Sometimes we have to suss this out kind of creatively. Instead of trying to figure out the ideal conditions for each and every one of the millions of organisms out there in the environment to allow them to grow in the lab, we simply grow them in the natural environment where they already have the conditions they need for growth. Okay, well, this is interesting. This is a tricky one. You got to see me mess up live on television, because it seems that what it's actually getting at is that option A. The fact that we've set up the status quo does actually set the stage for what makes Lewis's methods advantageous. Only about 1% of these organisms can be grown in a lab. The rest, in staggering numbers, have remained uncultured and have limited use to medical science until now. So A is actually the one we want. And what does A match up with the best? Well, what are we seeing here? We are again seeing that status quo. Natural microbial substances from soil bacteria and fungi have been at the root of most antibiotic drug development during the past century, but only about 1% of them can be grown in a lab, and the rest have remained uncultured, basically like uncontrolled and not being able to be used in medicine. So which of these most talks about sort of a status quo and how Lewis's methods alters that? So A, it identifies the requirements for soil bacteria to thrive and replicates those features in the artificial soil. Well, no, it doesn't really replicate anything. As we said before, if it were identifying everything as we went along, then that would actually be an inefficient method. Lewis talks about how we can't go microbe by microbe and figure out what each microorganism needs. B, does it enable soil bacteria to take in more nutrients than they typically consume in natural settings? Well, no, we're not giving the bacteria superfood or anything. We're actually trying to replicate those natural settings. C, It directly affects the cell walls of bacteria rather than the proteins those bacteria produce. Well, I didn't see anything about cell walls in option A. That might, tie in more to option D, but that's more about the efficacy of the microorganism, not of the methods. And D, it allows researchers to make use of soil bacteria that they had previously been unable to exploit. That's where we're getting at that established status quo from line 17 to 21. Here's what we have been doing, and here's how we need to improve that. Now, I'm sorry for taking you through that sort of maze. I know that was a really roundabout assault of that problem. And as you can see, it was indirect because it's saying that the passage suggests, right? We're not necessarily getting at super word for word, one-to-one answers. We're just getting at what the passage seems to hint at. Now, while that might have been confusing initially, I think now we have a much better idea of what's going on in the passage. So if we look at the first paragraph of passage 1, what does it primarily serve the passage by doing? Pathogens are acquiring resistance faster than we can introduce new antibiotics, and this is causing a human health crisis, says biochemist Kim Lewis of Northeastern University. Well, it seems to me that this paragraph is sort of introducing a problem that the upcoming methods that Lewis is about to introduce might help solve. So are we presenting a claim that is supported and developed over the passage? Well, I guess you could say that the health crisis is a claim, but they don't talk about it much throughout the rest of the passage. So I don't like A. B, to introduce a controversy that the study described in the passage is intended to resolve. No, I wouldn't say anything here is necessarily controversial, it's just problematic. There we go. I don't really like B. C, identify a problem that the research discussed in the passage may help to address. Yeah, that's the money right there. We have to know what the issue is before we know why we need a change. Offer a theory that is challenged by the findings? Well, no. There's nothing in paragraph 1 that's contradicted later on in passage 1. All right, so that might have been a bit painful, but we got through all the passage 1 questions. Now, we can just put passage 1 behind us until the very end. So let's read the blurb for passage 2. We're sort of resetting our clock. Passage 2 is adapted from David Livermore. This new antibiotic is cause for celebration and caution. Well, okay. So while the first passage seemed like a lot more just celebratory, this is a good thing, we're solving a problem, passage 2 seems to be a little more careful, a little more leery. So let's start sandwiching through passage 2. Many good antibiotic families, penicillin, streptomycin, tetracycline, come from soil fungi and bacteria. And this has long been suspected that if we could grow more types of bacteria from soil or from exotic environments such as deep oceans, that we might find new natural antibiotics. And look, we have our girl Kim Lewis mentioned right away. So this is the status quo that we're looking for new natural antibiotics. Let's look at the last sentence here. Once the bacteria, this simple and elegant methodology is their most important finding to my mind, for it opens a gateway to cultivating a wealth of potentially antibiotic-producing bacteria that have never been grown before. Okay, so he's just describing Kim Lewis's process that we just read about. And he's saying, at least on the forefront, this is a very good thing. This is very interesting, and this could help a lot. The first new antibiotic that they've found by this approach, Teixobactin, comes from a bacterium called blah blah blah. We don't need to waste our brain power on that. Is less exciting to my mind, though it doesn't look bad. Okay. So we're referencing Teixobactin. And he seems to have kind of a nuanced approach to it. He's not super pumped. It was also difficult to select Teixobactin resistance. Well, that might be an idea we need to come back to. So basically, the resistance to antibiotics that these bacteria are evolving, it's a little more difficult with this antibiotic Teixobactin, which is a good thing, right? We want our medicines to work for many, many years, not just until the bacteria get smarter. So what are my caveats? Now, if you don't know what a caveat is, those are just sort of asides. A caveat is, those caveats are the yes, but of the English language. It's like someone asked you to prom and you said, okay, I agree, but I have a few caveats. If you say, like, we can go, but it has to be as friends, right? That would be a caveat to your answer. Then this guy has 3. And I'm not going to get real into them, but I am going to note where they pop up. Second, first, and third caveats to his excitement. That's going to take 5 years and 500 million euros. And these are numbers we must find ways to reduce while not compromising safety if we're to keep ahead of bacteria, which can evolve far more swiftly and cheaply. All right, well, let's start doing the helicopter view of our questions. The author of passage 2 would most likely agree with which statement about the development of Teixobactin? That, to me, seems like a very broad question. We're being essentially asked, hey, what's this guy's opinion? And we don't know that unless we know the full, really, focus of the passage. So I'm going to save that for last. Used in line 79, caveats most nearly means, well, we've already talked about what caveats means, but that is a vocab and context question. So we're going to answer that right away, as soon as we hit the ground. In the last sentence in passage 2, the author uses the phrase 5 years and 500 million euros primarily to what? All right, well, that is sort of a line question. It's a little bit broad because we're talking about the use of a phrase, not just the meaning of the phrase, but definitely technically a line question, just not the one that I would answer first. Number 49, which choice best describes the relationship between passage 1 and passage 2? Okay, well, if you thought the questions before were broad, now we're getting into the broadest possible questions that we could ever find. You might want to put like an underline under this, or you might want to circle it twice. I don't know exactly what will work best for you on test day, but save those for the very last, because until you have a good idea of the main idea of both passages, you're not going to want to get into these. And all the rest, as is typically the case with double header passages, are the same kinds of mega broad questions. Both passages making a point, right? Unless you look at numbers 51 and 52, and what do you see? Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? Son of a gun, we've got another connected line question on our hands. So we might actually be able to answer that fairly early. Well, let's start with our vocab and context. As used in line 79, caveats most nearly means. Now, you've cheated because you've had me in your ear telling you what this is. But let's look at line 79. So what are my caveats? Well, I see 3. Now, I may have told you guys this already, but one thing I like to do on test day is literally just take my thumb and place it over the vocab question or the vocab word in question, and just ask myself, what other words could fit in there? So what are my caveats? Well, we might say, what are my exceptions? What are my reservations? What are the things I am reticent about? Okay, so we want to find something else that we could plug in there. Exceptions might be our best one. Restrictions, no. He's not really tying anything down. Misgivings, well, that's a more clearly negative word, right? Like, these are things I don't like about it, and I don't like this thing at all. That would be if he was like really taking down Kim Lewis's research. And explanations, no, he's already explained Kim Lewis's research, and Kim Lewis has already explained Kim Lewis's research. So really our best answer is A. In the last sentence of passage 2, the author uses the phrase 5 years and 500 million euros, primarily to what? That's going to take 5 years and 500 million euros, and these are numbers we must find ways to reduce while not compromising safety if we're to keep ahead of bacteria, which can evolve far more swiftly and cheaply. So he's saying, hey, germs are quick and they are not operating on a budget. We are operating on a budget, and we have safety concerns, and we have, a limited amount of time that we can do this in. That's how I would sort of summarize what he's doing there. He's saying, like, this is a place, pardon me, this is a way in which, like, our Kim Lewis's research and methods need to improve. So what most matches our understanding there? To emphasize the scale of effort needed to make Teixobactin available for consumer use. Well, yes, I guess he is emphasizing that. To criticize the level of funding that the government has committed to Teixobactin development. No, he's not really like saying the government is not giving us enough money. He's just saying it's too much money. To underscore the amount of time and money that has already been spent researching Teixobactin. Now that looks promising, but he's talking about future money, not past money. So I don't like C. D, compare the amount of money spent developing teixobactin with the amount spent developing other antibiotics. Well, no, he doesn't really get into that, right? Like, I don't see money anywhere else mentioned here. Don't see that euro sign if I'm skimming. He's really only comparing it to bacteria, not to antibiotics. So really, our best answer is A. Now let's look at 51 and 52 before we get into these mega broad questions. The information in passage 2 best supports which conclusion about the mice in the experiment described in passage 1? So we know that it's going to have to do something about the mice in the passage 1 experiment. Basically, now let's look at where the mice are mentioned in passage 1. Mice infected with bacteria that cause upper respiratory tract infections, including those, were treated with teixobactin, and the drug knocked out the infection with no noticeable side effects. Okay, seems like an unmitigated success on behalf of this mice experiment. But what would passage 2 have to say about this? Now, here's where this is important, and I want to teach you guys a quick lesson about the doubleheader passages again. So with doubleheader passages, you have basically a Venn diagram. You're operating in this sort of world. Passage 1 and passage 2. Now, because these passages are usually historical, like you probably don't have very strong opinions about antibacterial development, antibiotic development. You may feel very strongly about that. Usually the historical ones are the ones that'll really work us into a lather, because they'll be about things like slavery and things like women's rights, things that we might have very strong opinions about. But the point is that you, the reader, are not really being asked your own opinion. This is not a critical reading in that way. Really, all you're allowed to consider is, what does passage 1 say, right? What does passage 2 say? And how do those two overlap? So sometimes you'll be asked, like, hey, here's the thing about passage 1. What do you think it would say about this part of passage 2? And sometimes you'll be asked the reverse. You'll say like, oh, here's a passage in passage 2. What do you think passage 1 would say about that? You're not being asked for your opinion. You're being asked, what would passage 1's opinion be about passage 2? Right now, we're looking for information in passage 2 that supports the conclusion of the mice experiment. And it's going to be in one of these lines. So 52, option A is lines 51 to 56, starting with many and ending with antibiotics. Many good antibiotic families, penicillin, streptomycin, tetracycline, come from soil fungi and bacteria, and it has long been suspected that if we could grow more types of bacteria from soil or from exotic environments, such as deep oceans, that we might find new, natural antibiotics. Okay, does that have anything to do with the mice experiment? kind of, only in the fact that we're producing antibiotics, not that those antibiotics are successful. So I don't really like A. Line 64 to 68, starting with this and ending with before. This simple and elegant methodology is their most important finding to my mind, for it opens a gateway to cultivating a wealth of potentially antibiotic-producing bacteria that have never been grown before. So that's talking about the methodology, but not necessarily about teixobactin, as it's used with the mice. So B isn't super relevant to our concerns. C, line 69 to 72, starting with the first and ending with bad. The first antibiotic that they found by this approach, teixobactin, from a bacterium called blah, 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 is less exciting to my mind, though it doesn't look bad. Well, I mean, he sort of gives, like a halfway endorsement of the experiment with the mice. Let's look at D, see if it's any better. Lines 80 to 82, starting with it doesn't and ending with wall. It doesn't kill the gram-negative opportunists, as it is too big to cross their complex cell wall. Well, that doesn't really have anything to do with the mice. So yeah, I definitely don't like D, but perhaps I was too harsh on some of these earlier ones. Let's check the answer sheet again. Again, science is not my field, so I can get a little tangled up with these too. What we may have to do here is look a little more closely at the mice. So the mice infected with bacteria that cause upper respiratory tract infections were treated, right? So we have it knocking out those infections with no major side effects. All right, so it looks like what we're actually getting at here is sort of where this, pardon me, what we're actually getting at is what these infections were caused by. So if we look again at option D, Lines 80 to 82, starting with it doesn't and ending with wall. It doesn't kill the gram-negative opportunists as it is too big to cross their complex cell wall. Now, this is all part of his caveat that teixobactin isn't a potential panacea. If you know what a panacea is, it's just basically a cure-all, right? It just means that it takes care of everything. So D probably, oh, I see. So if we were to, we're lining this up, not with a conclusion in the passage, but with these potential conclusions given here. That wasn't a misreading of the passage. That was a misreading of the question on my part. So if teixobactin doesn't do, it doesn't affect those gram-negative bacteria, right? It can kill some things, but not all things. It's not a panacea. Well, then that would logically follow that the mice were not suffering from the thing that teixobactin cannot help. Option C here, these respiratory tract infections were likely not caused by gram-negative bacteria. And that makes sense because we, if the teixobactin treated the mice, then the mice couldn't have been affected by something that the teixobactin couldn't affect. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, do we get from that the exposure to teixobactin made them less susceptible to subsequent upper respiratory tract infections? No, I don't see really any evidence for that because we don't have anything given in passage 2 about future infections, right? B, gram-positive bacteria enhance the effectiveness of teixobactin against their upper respiratory tract infections. No, the gram-positive bacteria is not a helper here. It harms. D, teixobactin attacked the proteins of the bacteria that caused their upper respiratory tract infections. Attack the proteins. Well, right, that's not really connected to the gram-positive evidence that we found in number 52. So yeah, I don't really like D either. C is the clearest connection between the two. All right, so hopefully we've gotten a better handle on what these two passages' relationships are to each other. One passage is kind of giving forward a new branch of research and the promising results of some early experiments. But passage 2 is more, it gives caveats, right? It has not misgivings, but at least a few exceptions to what's about to go on. So which choice best describes this relationship? Passage 2 offers an evaluation of the significance of the research discussed in passage 1. I mean, I guess you could say it offers an evaluation. I like this one because it's neutral. It doesn't really say like passage 2 hates passage 1 or passage 2 unabashedly supports passage 1. It's just evaluating it. B, passage 2 suggests a modification to the methodology described in passage 1. No, I don't think at any point does passage 2 say like, hey, Kim Lewis needs to be testing these mice differently. That's not really what we get. C, passage 2 uses concrete examples to illustrate concepts considered in passage 1. No, we don't have a lot of concrete examples in passage 2. We're mostly concerned with his larger concerns, his caveats, right? D, passage 2 takes a dismissive stance regarding the findings mentioned in passage 1. Dismissive would mean that we've entirely let it go, right? Like if you're dismissed from class, you're leaving the room. That's not a nuanced take. So I don't really like D either. I think our best bet is A, an evaluation. If you can find those emotionally neutral options, those broadest possible looks, those are the ones that are going to give you the, I mean, they're best odds. It's not a guaranteed win, but the ones that give a very sort of honestly bland take of what's going on here, because it's in the specifics that you get tripped up. All right, number 50, both passages make the point that teixobactin could be useful in. If we think of that Venn diagram now, we're now thinking about the overlap. Right, we're thinking about what do both of the passages say. And what do they both say about teixobactin? Well, they both seem to think pretty positively of it, right? They could both be useful in what? A, standardizing the future development of antibiotics produced in laboratory environments. I don't know if teixobactin is going to be the thing that standardizes the development, right? That's more a question about methods, not a question about the antibiotic itself. B, combating infections that are no longer responding to treatment with other antibiotics. Pardon me. Yeah, that seems like our strongest bet so far. We're looking at the problem that Kim Lewis suggests. They're acquiring resistance faster than we can introduce new antibiotics. And does passage 2 agree with this? Cultivating a wealth of potentially antibiotic-producing bacteria that have never been grown before. It was also difficult to select teixobactin resistance. So we know that passage 1 says it. Passage 2 kind of says it. Controlling the spread of pathogenic soil fungi. No, we don't really see any soil pathogens, right? Where the pathogens are actually the thing that are giving us these antibacteria. D, shaping a new method of studying the effectiveness of antibiotics. Well, no, again, no one's really questioning the methods. The methods are fine. The problem is this health crisis that Kim describes. They're no longer responding to the treatment with other antibiotics. So D is out. B is really our only viable answer.